Welcome everyone, this is Virginia Parsons, your Hangout mentor and the host of the Inspirational Businesswoman Show, where it is my passion and my intention to provide you, the viewer, with a gold mine of entrepreneurial tips, strategies, and advice to grow your business from inspirational businesswomen in the know. However, today I have a very special edition interview for you that is going to feature one of my brother entrepreneurs that I know you're going to get valuable information from. So I'm looking forward to sharing everything with you. Before we get started, though, I'd like to let you know that the Inspirational Businesswoman Show is sponsored by hangout-marketing.com, where you can receive a free Hangout marketing assessment that is going to measure your skill sets and your knowledge base using Hangouts on Air so that you can brand and market yourself and stand out like a pro in your industry. So if you'd like to learn more about that, all you need to do is to text the word success, SUCCESS, to 307-269-2040. So all you have to do is pick up your phone, do the texting, and what's going to happen is you're going to take a very short survey. It will take you less than 5 minutes to do. It's going to give you a really good report on areas that you can go ahead and improve your knowledge base in Hangout marketing, and you might even qualify for a free strategy session with me where I'm going to help you take a look at your business and how you can use Hangouts on Air to grow your influence and to get noticed as an expert in your field. So speaking of that, we have a real expert today that I felt it was imperative to bring to you on the show. And that is none other than my brother entrepreneur, Ron Harvey. Now, Ron is an expert in bioremediation specialties and strategies. I know he's going to be able to explain it a lot better than I, for sure. He is the general manager of Echelon Environmental. And he has just years of background, actually about 30 years of background in hazardous waste remediation. He's been working with chemical, biological, and radiological cleanup for years around the country. And he has been asked to now train hospital healthcare workers on Ebola protective wear and equipment. So he's really in the know as far as what's going on with the Ebola the Ebola outbreak in Africa and what it means for us here in the United States. So he's also the author of the soon-to-be-released The Failure of Compliance. So he's got a lot of background and information that could be pertinent to each and every one of us. And you know, we've been hearing a lot about Ebola, and I don't know how much is fact, how much is fiction, how much is myth, but it's been creating a lot of fear in people, and I think a lot of it is because they're just not fully informed, or maybe there's been a lot of hype around Ebola that we need to really clarify. And that's why I wanted to bring Ron on today, because he's got the information to help us understand this outbreak and what to do about it for ourselves and our own individual lives. So here's some of the things we're going to be talking about. The degree of transmittability of Ebola. I think we all need to understand this and have a clarity around this idea. Then disease sequence and symptoms. You know, how does it get started? What is the sequence? What are the symptoms around Ebola? And finally, let's clear up some of the myths and the misunderstandings as well. So I'm really happy to have Ron with us today, and also want to, before we get started with Ron, I want to introduce also another co-host who's going to help ask some questions today, and that is Robin Hollins. So she's going to be here to help us because there's so many questions. It's hard to think of them all myself. I really appreciate Robin being here to help us. Robin, would you like to say hello?
Yeah, hi. I'm really happy to be here, Virginia and Ron. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation.
Terrific.
Looking forward to hearing.
Come on and say hi to our audience.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm so glad to be here. Virginia, thank you very much for asking that we could be able to do this. You were the one that brought this idea up, And the moment you did, I said, let's do it, because I think that it's really important for people to get past the assumptions and the assertions that the mainstream media have been so very good at producing. And so I'm just very glad to be here to help alleviate some of the fear. That's really what it boils down to. That's what I want to try to do.
Oh, we're thrilled to have you here to do that for us, Ron. I've got a question about your background. I know that's not a normal background. Would you like to share with our audience what's going on behind the scenes there with you?
Yes. Well, I read last night on the internet that you can get viruses through your computer. So I wanted to make myself a little Ebola containment area to make sure that I didn't get the Ebola virus while we were doing this interview. Because who knows? We may just be able to pass it back and forth by chatting, on Google Plus. Who knows?
And we know that's totally a myth, right, Ron?
Did I just start a terrible rumor? I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that.
No, we really do want to take this seriously. It is a serious topic, but some of the misunderstandings and the myths around it get people really upset and making what we would probably say are not the best decisions for themselves. Before we get started on that, though, let me give you an opportunity to share with people why I thought you would be a great person to talk about this topic. Instead of it always just being out in the news media, I thought that you had a very interesting perspective and background on this. So share with the audience a little bit about your background and why you are someone who can talk with authority about this disease and its transmissibility.
All right, sure. Let's see. I've been in the hazardous waste business, as you said, for about 30 years now. I've handled just about every chemical under the sun, everything from completely inane materials to some of the most dangerous chemicals that you can find. And the radioactive waste handling was also a very important lesson for me, because it was all about contamination. That's what you are most concerned about. Most of the time, the chemicals or the radioactive materials aren't going to do you any harm unless you physically come in contact with them. And so in the 30 years that I've been in the business, my job has been to prevent contact with the chemicals, whether it's by breathing them in or by physical contact with your hands or absorption through your skin, or some of the routes of exposure that you can be absorb chemicals, that you can be exposed to chemicals through. And so my specialty has been, all these years, personal protective equipment, and that's what you use when you're handling something that's dangerous. You use PPE, as we call it in the business, and that material or that equipment will prevent you from being harmed by the materials that you're handling. And as we've seen with the healthcare workers that are handling the Ebola patients, is that the personal protective equipment that they've been using has either been inadequate or they have used it improperly. And so like you said earlier also, I've been contacted by a couple of the local hospitals here in New Mexico, and they have asked me to put together a training program for the people that are going to be, hopefully not, but in the event that they would be handling some of the Ebola patients, because there is a very serious regimen of personal protective equipment that you need to put together in order to safely handle the patients themselves.
Fabulous. I have one question before we get into the specific topic of Ebola and transmissibility, etc., and that is, because I'm curious, what have you in your 30 years of experience found to be the most difficult area for protection and hazardous waste management?
That's an excellent question. The most serious problem that I've ever dealt with in the handling chemicals, for instance, is not contamination, which is basically you touching something with your hands, picking up sticking your hands in some nasty chemicals. That's direct contact. But what is most frequent in terms of contamination is what's called cross-contamination, which is basically I touch something that's dirty. Now my gloves are dirty. And so then I touch something else, okay, so I've now transferred those chemicals to another surface, say a telephone or a computer or something like that, and then somebody comes along and picks up that same piece of equipment without a pair of gloves on. Now they've been exposed. It's secondary exposure, and it's called cross-contamination. And those, that is the primary method that the various healthcare workers that have been handling the patients and then gotten exposed to the virus. That's how they've gotten it. They haven't just gone in and just been handling people without any equipment. They've been improperly using the equipment that they have.
Excellent.
So
well, I think that leads us right on into the key topic as far as Ebola's concerns are, and the stages of transmissibility and the symptoms. Where would you like to start in sharing that with us, Ron?
Well, okay. First, I would like to talk about the origin of the disease. In this last outbreak, back in December of 2013, if I remember correctly, the first case of Ebola was reported with a little girl in, I think she was in Congo, that picked up the virus, and then it took off from there. It certainly has been a very, very serious epidemic in Africa. The primary see, what happens is that there are outbreaks. Obviously, since 1976, there have been probably a couple of dozen outbreaks of Ebola virus. Each time the outbreak comes and then it goes, and then, well, what happens to that virus in between is that it's harbored in what they call a reservoir, which is assumed at this point to be probably bats in Africa. And so then at some point, these bats kind of harbor the disease, but they don't die from it generally. And then at some point, they believe that the virus had been transmitted to the different people because they were eating these bats. And unfortunately, they were not cooking them properly. And the disease can also be transferred from the bats to other animals that the people there were eating. And that's primarily the thought for how this outbreak began. The way this disease is transmitted, it's by direct physical contact with people that are sick from the disease. The only people that you've seen getting the Ebola virus is either the people that are handling patients in primarily in Africa. It's been the family members of the people that are sick, because a lot of these people don't have hospitals to go to, so they would be caring for the people themselves, handling them directly, and then they get the virus, and then the other group of people that have been getting the virus are the healthcare workers that have been handling the patients as well, and obviously not nearly as many. To date, there were 500 healthcare workers that have contracted the disease. Approximately 300 of them have died. So that's.
May I ask a question?
Certainly.
Those healthcare workers are in Africa as part of this whole Africa scenario that you're describing?
That's correct. Yes, and a very good portion of them were doctors and nurses that came in from other countries to try to help with the the World Health Organization had a lot of people. Doctors Without Frontiers came in. There's quite a few other charitable groups that would come in there and try to help, and they wound up getting the disease.
And do you attribute that to the lack of containment then, as being that they might have had someone else's gloves, or they just weren't properly equipped with, like?
Yes, there's unfortunately, when the disease began, they probably didn't have the personal protective equipment on hand to deal with it. Now, of course, you've got people, during the course of the disease, they are producing quite a bit of bodily materials that are contagious, that have the virus in it, and so when you start handling patients that are vomiting, once they get really sick, they're vomiting, they've got diarrhea, and of course the healthcare workers are trying to clean all that up, and it's if you are not very careful with those materials, you have a very good chance of contracting the disease. And then, of course, once the people died, they had to bury them. And so they just picked them up and brought them wherever they were going to go and buried them. And we can talk about that as part of one other discussion too.
But I could just say, as a person who has mishandled chicken on a cutting board, which is like a very different scenario, but I can imagine, how careful I have to be with chicken and the cutting board, that dealing with these life materials, waste or whatever that people are creating who are sick, you must have to take just the most painstaking of precautions.
I have one story here that I just want to relate quickly, is that in the local hospitals have asked me, what are we going to do if a patient comes in with Ebola and we decontaminate them, and all that wash water is collected, and then what do we do with it? And I asked the state here, how is that material classified in terms of disposal? Medical waste has special disposal requirements, and they have not been able to answer that question for me. So, I mean, it's almost like they're afraid to even tell anybody what to do, because if they tell somebody to do something wrong, then obviously they've got some liability issues at that point. So, I mean, quite a few people are very, very afraid of this disease. Well, as I showed on one of the earlier slides in the PowerPoint, there was that that knowledge is the antidote to fear. Ralph Waldo Emerson said that, and so hopefully here we can put a little knowledge out there so that people aren't nearly afraid of a contagion that's just going to break out and cover everybody. That certainly is not going to happen. I mean, I've stuck out my neck a couple of times now and said that the difficulty in transmitting the disease is going to help us in terms of controlling this outbreak.
So prevention being the most important.
So I just want to bring this map up because it is a picture of the United States with the Ebola strain over the top of it, and it's what you're talking about, Ron. It is about the fear that comes from not having all the facts, or from having part of the facts but not in the right perspective. So I know Robin has a question directly related to that. I'm just wanted to throw this up as a visual, but Robin, what did you want to ask Ron around this area of fear and misinformation?
Right, and the mass media will give us the impression that this is going out of control and there's nothing we can do about it, and clearly there are definitely serious things to be concerned with. But Is this something that is spreading, or are we being told the truth about this? What do we as regular people need to know so that we don't have a widespread outbreak in the United States?
Okay, well, so far, and I just did a little quick searching this morning for some information, there have been 4 cases of Ebola in the United States since the beginning of October, I think was the first one. And one of those 4 people have died. So it's pretty hard to call that an outbreak, although the seriousness of the disease is, certainly warrants concern. But okay, in terms of what you can do to protect yourself, it's really quite simple. If you know somebody that has Ebola, don't touch them, because that's how the disease is transmitted. It is directly transmitted by touching another person that is sick with Ebola, as in sick as in symptomatic. Let me back up just a moment in that the course of the disease generally begins between 8 to 10 days after exposure is when you begin to show symptoms of the disease. And it is not until you show symptoms that you are actually contagious. And at the beginning, you're even just slightly contagious. It gets worse as the disease progresses in the body. You actually become more contagious. For instance, Virginia, you asked earlier about the people on the airplanes, and it's sad that people are changing plans for travel based on the fact that they're afraid that somebody else with Ebola is going to be on the airplane, because it is if they're well enough to just be walking around and traveling, going through airports and all that good stuff, they're simply not symptomatic enough to be able to transmit the disease to anyone. If you're sitting 5, 10, 15 rows back from somebody in an airplane that has Ebola, your chances of getting the disease are 0, because it is simply not a disease that is easily transmitted. If you could go to that slide.
Sure, just a moment, I'll bring it up.
Because
but
it's
Ron,
a very good...
if you're in the airplane and you use the restroom, and somebody with Ebola who's slightly symptomatic was there before you, is there a way that you could pick up something from them, or are there precautions to take there?
Some very simple precautions are in order in just about any public place these days, because Ebola is certainly not the only disease going around. The virus itself is very easily treated. Simple the alcohol hand rubs, the ones you see you can buy at Walmart and anywhere else. They are very effective in deactivating the virus on your hands. Bleach, even a very dilute solution of bleach, 1 part to 100, is effective in killing the virus. So wow. It's if you put a simple barrier, even a piece of paper, if you feel that you really need to, you can take a Kleenex or something and open the handle of the plane. That will work, because the virus has to come in direct contact with your skin. But the slide that Virginia has up here is, I found this one, and I thought it was very important, because it indicates the relative transmissibility of a disease. On this slide, every one person that is sick with the disease and in a communicable state, in general, will transmit on average that disease to a certain number of people. That's called the R0 number, and that's what's portrayed on this graph here, where it shows hepatitis C and Ebola at a R0 value of 2. which means that your average person sick with Ebola will transmit that disease to 2 other people. Okay, so that sounds like a lot. I mean, that would be arithmetic progression. But I don't see everybody going around as concerned about hepatitis C as Ebola. And I can tell you that hepatitis C is a whole lot more prevalent in the general population than Ebola is. But they're equally transmissible. The HIV virus is twice as has an R0 value of 4. It's twice as transmittable as the Ebola virus, and I don't see people running around all scared about getting HIV unless they're engaging in certain activities that would expose them to that disease. And by the way, HIV and Ebola are transmitted almost the same way. You have to have direct contact. Now, mumps, you can see on the scale here, 1 person can transmit that disease to 10 other people, and measles is near the top of the scale with a R0 value of 18, showing you that your average person in the course of the disease can transmit the measles to 18 other people. That's huge. Now, that would be something that's really very contagious. Comparatively, then, you can see that the probability of passing Ebola from one person to the next is quite low on the scale of disease transmissibility.
Well, that brings to mind years ago, when it was back in the early 80s, when AIDS became a concern to people, that there was also a lot of misinformation, and people were just so afraid to be around, anyone, that they might be exposed to AIDS. And again, it was because they didn't have all the facts. So there were a lot of rumors going around and myths going around about it that now, of course, years later have been dispelled, and people are quite calm and relaxed about the potential of getting AIDS, unless, as you say, their
Right.
behaviors increase their risk factor, and then at least they're aware of what to do to protect themselves. So it gets back to protection, doesn't it, Ron? And using the proper protective equipment and protective clothing, which is, again, what you're specializing in.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit more about the stages of the disease, because you had talked about, well, in the early stages it's not very transmittable, and that's why someone who's capable of getting onto an airplane, going through the airport, having the energy to do that, is more than likely not in a highly state of transmissibility, even if they have the virus. Is that correct?
That is correct, and we have another slide that shows the four steps of the chain of infection.
All right, let me bring that up for you.
Because that relates perfectly to your question there.
Okay,
yes, there are 4 events that have to take place in order for a disease of any kind to be transmitted from one person to another. The disease itself has to be sufficiently virulent to be contagious from one person to the next, and of course, most diseases are, but obviously some of them are more virulent, like smallpox, for instance. Killed tens of millions of people back in the 1917-18. That was an extremely virulent disease. We can see in Africa right now. I saw this morning that 13,000 cases so far of Ebola have been reported in Africa, 5,000 deaths. That's a significant disease. I mean, certainly don't want to downplay that. But the disease has to be sufficiently virulent. The relatively high concentration of the pathogen must be present in the person that is sick, and that, as we were saying, when you first begin to show symptoms, your the viral load in your body is relatively low, and let's see, I was looking at some very specific numbers earlier. The detection level for the virus is about 4,000 particles per cubic centimeter, I believe, is what the measurement is. When you begin to show symptoms, you're up in the 10,000 to 100,000 viral particles per milliliter. Once you begin to get really sick, the load is in the tens of millions of viral particles per cubic centimeter or milliliter of blood. And by the time you die, it's in the billions of viral particles per milliliter, which is an extremely high concentration of the pathogen. And that's why when someone begins to get sick, the amount of virus actually that they can transmit is relatively low, because they simply don't have that much of the virus. It hasn't reproduced sufficiently in their body. And then the next step is the mechanism to transmit the disease from the person that's sick to the next person. And the mechanisms can be through the air, they can be through physical contact, and there are other ways. Obviously, sharing dirty needles is another mechanism for transportation of the virus. And then once the virus has come in contact with the uninfected person, it has to have a route of entry into the body. Generally speaking, the Ebola virus has to enter your body through some kind of an abrasion in your skin. If you come in direct contact with somebody, there has to be some breakdown in your skin, which is a protective layer, before the virus can actually get in. So those are the 4 steps in the chain of infection. And if any one of those steps doesn't happen, you cannot get the infection from another person.
I think this is important to pause on this point, Ron.
Okay.
All 4 steps must occur for someone to actually have the disease transmitted to them. Now, you said something about air being one of the means of mechanisms of transportation from the host to the other person. And I know that's a scare for some people, so I think you need to clarify what you mean by it could be transmitted through the air in order to then correctly have the portal of entry into the person who might get it. Can you clarify that for us?
Sure. The virus is present in saliva, in mucus fluids. Basically, if you were to sneeze and you had the virus, those viral particles would be present in the droplets that you would eject when you sneeze or cough. Fortunately, though, sneezing and coughing are not one of the symptoms of Ebola patients. They generally aren't doing that. It's not like a common cough, the common cold, where you're going to be coughing and sneezing a lot. So that isn't a terrible risk. And also, you have to be within 3 feet. The CDC has done some experiments, and they did successfully transmit the disease by particles from one monkey to another. But to the best of my ability, I've looked at that, and I do not believe that there is a reported case yet of a person transmitting Ebola from one person to another by means of aerosolized saliva during coughing or sneezing. And I'd like to address another one too, because as Robin said, you could be afraid of touching the doorknobs or a phone or elevator buttons or something like that. But that is also, first off, the virus only lives for somewhere between 5 and 24 hours outside the body. It dies relatively quickly. And there is only one case so far that's been reported of a man catching a disease, catching Ebola from another material. And the way it happened was that there was an Ebola patient that died with a blanket. apparently he was using a blanket, he died, and then another man got that blanket and used it and got the virus through it. But that is the one recorded instance so far of a secondary surface actually being able to transmit the disease from one human to another. So you know, going out in public and being worrying about touching surfaces and getting Ebola is a truly unfounded fear.
Let me bring this slide up for you to emphasize that point a little further, Ron.
Yeah, as I stated earlier, the only people so far that have been infected with the Ebola virus are those that are handling, I mean, physically handling people, other people that have the virus, and so it's the family members and healthcare workers that have been able to pick up the disease from other people. Basically, if you're walking around, you are not infectious to other people because the viral load in your body is insufficient to kick off that chain of infection that we just mentioned. And like basically, if you the only way you are really going to get you stand a significant chance of getting the Ebola virus is by physically handling someone else that has the virus, and obviously that is not a significant concern for the vast majority of Americans or really anybody else anywhere.
Robin, I'm sure you've got some questions. Go
yeah,
ahead.
that brings up that question that I have about whether our hospitals are really prepared and ready to handle this if somebody walks in with it. And along with that question, I also would like to know, I've been seeing reports of nurses who had the virus and are out now. They're done, they're cured. And I'd like to understand that better.
Okay, let's see, the first question, I'm sorry, the first question again, one more time, sorry.
Are our hospitals equipped to be able to handle this without any trouble, to contain it and to, in fact, help these patients who do have it?
I would say, generally speaking, no, they're not. And it's not because they're inadequately equipped, but they don't have the training necessary to use the equipment properly. When I put together the training for the hospitals here, the CDC has put out a guideline for the entire process of putting on all your protective equipment, going in and handling the patient, and then coming back out. And actually, the most dangerous part of the whole process is when you come back out and take off your contaminated personal protective equipment. The CDC actually requires a person who is knowledgeable in decontamination to sit there and check off one by one about a 30-step procedure to take off all of your protective equipment. And that is something that you're not going to get that from just, you know, reading an article on how to do it. It's something that you actually have to be trained and you have to practice. So to answer your question, no. If somebody were to come in there seriously ill from Ebola, they would be in a precarious position because they simply don't have the understanding about how to prevent contaminating themselves after handling someone that's sick.
Mm-hmm.
And does that relate to why we ended up with 2 nurses who were infected with the disease from the man in Texas?
That's correct. Yes. Well, you know, I read a story just earlier this morning about one of the first nurses that did get sick. I think actually she was the first nurse to get sick back. She was in the U.S. and she told, after she recovered, that she was given a 30-minute discussion about how to protect herself using the protective equipment. And in 30 minutes, I'm sorry, okay, I've got her statement right here. What did she say here? Let's see. Well, okay, I don't see it right at the moment. Okay.
Yeah, I think I remember seeing
So the
that
point
too.
here is, the point
she was
here,
given
Ron,
30
is that,
minutes of training.
I'm sorry, say that again?
She was given approximately 30 minutes of training by another nurse on how to protect herself. And unfortunately, the nurse that attempted to train her obviously did not do an adequate job.
Well, the point I wanted to bring home on this is that they may have had the proper protective wear, but without the training on how to properly use the protective wear, there's still the possibility of transmissibility, because they were dealing with a patient who had a high level, whatever you said, the parts per million or billion are, of the pathogen in their system. So
Correct.
That's what made them so susceptible to picking up the disease, because at that point was highly transmissible.
Absolutely, yes. If someone is dying of Ebola, they are highly infectious. You have to be extremely careful. Actually, that's one of the reasons I built my enclosure here, because that's part of the program that the CDC has set up, that you actually have a containment area that your patient is in, and you go in one end and that end is clean, and then you go in and handle the patient, and then you go out another exit from the room, and that is a contaminated area. The decontamination area is, the decontamination process is explicit. I mean, it is actually, I've seen a lot of decon procedures, and that is the most intensive one I've ever seen. So they really do have the process down. It's actually training the people how to do it that is the difficulty.
Wow.
One more question around that Texas case that we had discussed earlier, I think is interesting, and that is when you're talking about decontamination and disposal of hazardous waste, in this case biohazard waste, that I think the viewers would find of interest, and that is how they went about removing those contaminants from the home, and again, some of the myths around disposing of this waste I think people would find of interest.
Yes, I have a very interesting story that hardly anybody knows about. In Dallas, they hired that crew to go down there, and I know who they were, and they did an excellent job. They decontaminated the heck out of that place. They came out with approximately 100 barrels full of materials from the house. Was that going a little too far? Sure, maybe it was. But that actually they had a little bit of a difficulty, because at first there was not a facility that wanted to accept the waste for disposal. That's how afraid everybody was. I mean, nobody wanted to take it. And eventually a company down in Texas did receive the material, and they incinerated it in a chemical disposal facility, a hazardous waste incinerator, which was complete destruction. There were no viral, nothing left after going through that incinerator. But there is a bunch of ash. So they took that ash and they loaded it onto a couple of trucks, and those trucks went over to Louisiana to a landfill, where they were going to landfill the ash from the incinerator. The state attorney general for Louisiana stopped those trucks at the border and said, we don't want that ash in our state because we think it may still be contagious. And I'm afraid to say I've never heard of anything so ludicrous in my whole life, because the CDC themselves says if you take a person that has died from Ebola and you cremate them, okay, you can handle those ashes without any personal protective equipment at all. But then here we got the state of Louisiana stopping the shipment of the incinerated just materials that somebody with Ebola touched. It's, you know, I'm afraid to say that, you know, sometimes people just really don't know what they're doing when they make decisions like that. But unfortunately, it was a very expensive proposition. The decontamination of that house cost about $100,000.
And didn't you say, Ron, that there's really just a 24-hour period after which that virus cannot do anything? It cannot propagate or infect anybody?
That is correct. If you, let me elaborate a little bit. If the virus can live for up to 5 days, if I remember, it's either 5 or 6 days under ideal conditions.
In a body, that's alive.
Well, outside of the body.
Okay.
Inside the body, the actual remains of an Ebola victim are still contagious, I believe, for somewhere up to 20 days. But obviously, if somebody has died from Ebola, you just don't touch them. But the remains, pardon me, a surface, let's say, because I believe that your sweat can actually transmit the disease, that the virus is in there. So if you're all sweaty and you touch a surface, within 24 hours the virus is dead. And so, you know, going in and essentially emptying that person's house of belongings was a little bit of an overreaction, to put it mildly, because just like I said earlier, alcohol will kill the virus. A bleach solution is what you use to, and the alcohol rubs are what you use to decontaminate yourself after handling a patient. So, you know,
they just soaked everything in bleach and then put it in the landfill directly, everything would have been fine, and it would have cost a lot less.
They very well could have done that. Well, as I mentioned earlier, I'm having some discussions with the state here as to how to classify these different wastes, and they've actually been afraid to give me a classification for the different kinds of Ebola waste, and which is going to make it very difficult for me and for a hospital if somebody with Ebola comes in and they don't have any kind of guidance as far as how they're supposed to properly dispose of the waste. I assume at that point somebody would coerce them into making a decision, but they haven't been able to do it for me yet.
Well, I know we're wrapping up here, but I'd like to bring up just this one other quick quiz. I think that it will in itself help abate fears and overcome some of the myths of transmissibility, which is really what you've been talking about today. So I thought you might want to go over this briefly, Ron, just to finalize and summarize things.
Sure. It's a very, very simple question as to whether or not you can have come in contact with the Ebola virus. Is if you have touched the vomit, blood, sweat, saliva, urine, or feces of someone, and it says here who might have Ebola. No, that doesn't work. They have to be active, symptomatic, I mean actually sick with the disease. If you haven't touched any of those materials, you do not have Ebola. You cannot have Ebola. And so it's just very, very simple. If you are not handling Ebola patients, you cannot get the disease.
Okay, great. Let me just bring us back here. For those of our viewers who have been with us today, we want to thank you for coming. This has been a very special pre-recorded interview, and I hope that you found the information valuable and that you can as well go ahead and share this information with others so we can do a little bit to start to abate the fears and the myths around this disease. It is a serious disease, and that's why we wanted to talk about it and how it's treated and how you protect yourself from it, from someone who's an expert in, you know, hazardous waste and how to deal with it. I'm going to leave this for final thoughts and questions. Start with you, Robin, and then Ron will just leave you with some final thoughts for the viewers. Go ahead, Robin.
Sure. My final question is, it seems as though there is a vaccine, not a vaccination, but a cure. Like there's something that has happened that is allowing people to, caught at the right time, actually come out the other side and continue on with their lives. Is that correct?
Oh, okay. To date, there is no licensed vaccine for the Ebola virus. But there are 2 or 3 experimental medicines that have been used, and there is also some of the people that have survived have received blood transfusions from other people that have survived the disease, so that obviously they're counting on some antibodies to be able to do some work there. So yes, there are treatments.
Okay, good. Thank you.
And I also want to let you know that because this is pre-recorded, we will not have an opportunity for the after show that we normally do have. But I'd like you to go ahead and feel free to write your questions to Ron in the comments section. And Ron will be happy to get back to you and answer any of those questions that he can. I think he's clarified so much for us today, and I really appreciate that. For me, my final thoughts, and then I'll pass it over to Ron, are that information is power, and getting factual information is really empowering, because I think we all need to stay calm about this, recognize, yes, it's a serious condition if someone does pick it up, but the potential for transmissibility to me makes it something to not be concerned about. I'm much more concerned about the flu myself, and I do everything I can to stay healthy in that regard. But I hope that this has helped to really calm people's fears and have a much more realistic understanding of this disease, and the potential for it to spread across the United States, I think, is slim, as Ron has said. So I want to myself thank you all for being here today. Ron, any final thoughts you want to share with our audience?
Well, it would be that you really don't have to worry about getting the Ebola virus. You can very easily avoid the infection, very easily. Simply don't be afraid. And just you can go about your normal life. There, like Virginia just said, there's lots of other sicknesses out there that are much more prevalent. Yeah, don't listen to the media hype. Just take a deep breath. It's going to be okay.
Wonderful. Robin, how about you? Any final thoughts about what you learned from the show today?
Yeah, I'm relieved. I'm reassured. I'm happy to be equipped actually with this information so I can spread this, and I think that's really awesome, because there is a lot of misinformation out there. So I think stay cool, wash your hands, use Purell or whatever, and let people know that it's been overhyped in the media. It's definitely a problem in Africa, and we have the resources to handle this.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ron and Robin. Thank you for being here. And again, thank you all of our viewers. Again, take this information and share it. And there's no better media to share it on than the fact that you have this video available to you, and you can share it with your friends and family and loved ones and let them watch this as well. So make sure you go ahead and like the video. We'd appreciate that. And take it out and share it on the other social media networks. Let's do a viral spread of good quality facts and information, and stop spreading myths and rumors. This is Virginia Parsons, your Hangout mentor and host of the Inspirational Businesswoman Show, and I want to thank Ron for being here, our brother entrepreneur, and for sharing such valuable information. Thanks again. Bye now.
Bye, thank you.